Good afternoon and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on our YouTube channel. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you about two programs coming up next week here in this theater. On Wednesday, January 25th at noon, Nate Jones, Director of the Freedom of Information Act project for the National Security Archives, will be here to discuss his new book, Able Archer 83, The Secret History of the NATO Exercise That Almost Triggered Nuclear War. And on Thursday, January 26th at 7, former Secretary of Defense Robert M. Gates will discuss his latest book, A Passion for Leadership, Lessons on Change and Reform from 50 Years of Public Service. A book signing will follow the program. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibitions, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby, as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive them by regular email or email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are membership applications also in the lobby or at archivesfoundation.org. On this very evening in 1961, Dwight Eisenhower spoke to the American people one last time as President of the United States. His farewell address, lasting less than 10 minutes and televised to the nation from the Oval Office, is one of the most famous speeches in American history. The President acknowledged the challenge facing the nation and then pursued the theme of balance in how we might address those challenges. Noting that the military establishment was vastly different from what it had been in previous decades, Eisenhower warned against the undue influence of the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower's words struck a chord with Americans, and when the National Archives asked people in 2003 to vote for the 100 most important documents in United States history, this farewell address made the list. Bret Baier, in focusing on the 3 days between Ike's speech and the inauguration of John F. Kennedy, highlights Eisenhower's lifetime career in public service. He, like many writers looking into the life and work of a modern president, availed himself of the unparalleled resources, both documents and of personnel, in the presidential libraries, which are part of the National Archives. As Bret acknowledges in his book, staff at the Eisenhower, Truman, and Kennedy libraries helped him find his way through their collections, as they do for all researchers who come to use their resources. Our presidential libraries are unparalleled repositories for students of the American presidency, and I encourage you to explore them in person or online. Bret Baier currently serves as chief political anchor of Fox News Channel and anchor and executive editor of Special Report with Bret Baier. He has previously served Fox News as chief White House correspondent and as national security correspondent based at the Pentagon. He has reported from 74 countries, including multiple assignments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Baier is the New York Times bestselling author of Special Heart, A Journey of Faith, Hope, Courage, and Love. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bret Baier.
I have your book as a prompt. I'll give it back to you. Thank you so much, David. That really means a lot. I'm really happy to be here, especially on this day, which is 56 years to the day from Eisenhower's farewell address. He would have delivered it tonight from the Oval Office, an address that he worked on for almost 2 years, 21 different drafts of that speech. There was no audience other than the photographers and reporters in the room and a few staff members. It wasn't McCormick Place in Chicago with a big audience. It wasn't as George W. Bush did at West Point. It was simple, and that was a lot about who Dwight D. Eisenhower was. Plain-spoken, Kansan, somebody who wanted to think about all of his experiences as general to president. Before I get into my book and what got me to this book, I want to acknowledge David and his staff. I do it in the book, in acknowledgments, but it's invaluable what they did to help me and my researcher and co-author Catherine Whitney. The National Archives, through them, history comes to life. I truly believe that. And when I thought about the premise of this book, that was my goal, is to breathe history into a time and a place where, at least my generation and younger, it seemed that history started with Kennedy. And if you asked people about it, and young people especially, about Eisenhower, they would think about General Eisenhower and not exactly President Eisenhower. That's what really got me going down that road. But the work that the archives, the libraries helped us do, the staff, the ability to house and keep these millions and millions of documents and have access to them, it's just at your fingertips how much stuff we can learn from our past. The dedication to this book is to my children, our children. My wife had a role in that too. Paul and Daniel. And I write, to our sons, Paul and Daniel, and their generation, please allow history to inform your decisions in the future. And I believe that that's what we're trying to do with this book. Let me tell you how I got here. I'm a golfer. I played golf in college, and I had the holy grail of golf invites to Augusta National. And it was a thrill of a lifetime. And I went down there, and I drove down Magnolia Lane, that famous drive. And for a golfer, it gives you goosebumps when you think about it. You arrive at the clubhouse, and you're actually going to play the course where they play the Masters. And I arrive, and they say, Mr. Baier, you're staying in the Eisenhower cabin. And I was thrilled. The Eisenhower cabin, if you know, is not really a cabin. It's more like a small White House. It sits on the 10th tee of Augusta National, the golf course, and it overlooks the par 3. It's an idyllic setting, gorgeous, and I walked in there, and it's decorated essentially as it was in the 50s. This was Eisenhower's Southern White House. George W. Bush had his ranch in Crawford. Reagan had his ranch out in California. This was where Eisenhower went, and he was a big fan of golf. Well, I couldn't sleep because I was jacked up to play this round of a lifetime, and I poured myself a glass of wine, and I walked around the Eisenhower cabin. And I looked at all the memorabilia and the writings, the paintings that Eisenhower did. He became, much like Bush did later in life, a painter, and he had paintings of different holes and different people. There were pictures of him interacting with different people as president. And I came to realize what I just talked about, that I didn't know, even though I cover Washington and I cover politics, that much about President Eisenhower. So I vowed after that round to go out to Abilene, Kansas, the Eisenhower Library, Boyhood Home, and Museum. And I made it there. I recommend it highly to get out there. It's not easy to get out there, but once you get out there, it is a wonderful place. It is a gem in the heartland of America. His boyhood home is there. He's buried there in a chapel, and the museum, spectacular. So I went there and I talked to them, and they said, and again, these are the staff at the library, said, you know, many books have been written about Eisenhower, but this time, the transition from President Eisenhower to President Kennedy had not really been focused on intently, nor had the farewell address specifically. So I said, that's interesting. I mean, you know, is there that much there? Can I write a book about that? And they said, come with us. And they take me back to the area where the library is, the documents, and they put white gloves on. I put white gloves on. And this woman comes out with a gray box that's protected. It's like cardboard, sets it on this big wood table, and very slowly takes out of the box this plastic folder, and slowly takes out of the folder these papers, and they hand them to me. And it was the farewell address that Eisenhower delivered 56 years ago tonight, with his scribblings, markings, underlinings, capitalization, moving words. This is the one he delivered that night. This was the 21st draft I was holding in my hands. And that is living history, because it just gave me goosebumps thinking about what he was trying to do and say, And that's where I started to get the thought that these 3 days, this transition, would enable me to breathe life into that time and then bounce back from that soda straw view to a look at General Eisenhower and President Eisenhower's time in office. So that began a 3.5-year journey with researchers and a lot of visits to the library. We went to the Kennedy Library, the Truman Library, and it was a labor of love in the middle of an election season that was just a little crazy, just a tad. So what I found was that Eisenhower was an underappreciated president. He, if you look at his accomplishments, got us out of Korea, passed with Congress the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, had a booming economy at the time, passed with Republicans and Democrats a massive National Highway Act that set up and built the interstate system that we drive on today. He put "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. "In God we trust" is the national motto because of President Eisenhower. It's on our currency because of President Eisenhower. He was the president who set up the first national prayer breakfast and the day of prayer. He had a thought about keeping us out of war, but being strong to the point where you could have aggressive diplomacy and convince people, like the Soviets, who were very aggressive at the time, that you would hold your own. He was a humble leader who allowed others to take the credit for a lot of things. Political scientist Fred Goldstein called it the hidden hand leadership. He liked to play bridge, Eisenhower did. And it was about holding his cards until he was ready to show exactly what was happening. Speaking of humble leadership, you go back to his time as general, and he wins World War II. And amazing stories, we'll come back to that from that time that we also found in the archives at the library. But he wins World War II. Essentially, he comes back as a hero and is doing ticker tape parades around the country. He eventually ends up at a parade at Abilene, Kansas, his hometown. And he's in the back of the car, and he's waving, and the streets are packed, and everyone's cheering. And someone turns to his mother, Ida Eisenhower, and says, "You must be so proud of your son." And she says, "Which one?" They had 6 sons. And he says that his family kept him humble from the beginning. I like to say my wife does the same thing. He grew up in the heartland, as I mentioned, and it was a modest, very modest beginning. It was a very religious family, all about values, and he played football, he worked, but he eventually gets to West Point. And there at West Point, he's not a great student. He is okay, middle of his class, but he impresses the leadership there as being someone who's strategic, who can deal with other people. And frankly, he moves up the chain in the military quickly because of that trait. He dealt with the huge egos of the time, the Bradleys, the Pattons, the MacArthurs, and he was able to get them on the same page. Few people know that he was the speechwriter for General Douglas MacArthur as a colonel, and he crafted those speeches as MacArthur would travel. He makes it up through the military and catches the eye of the president, FDR, who decides that it is Eisenhower who is going to lead the effort overseas, the European effort. Fast forward through Operation Torch you get to the D-Day operation. He's dealing then with different egos. Montgomery from Great Britain, de Gaulle from France, others who are, General Petraeus called it giants of the earth at that time. And he gets them together. It is hairy. It's not an easy thing at that moment. It could go south at any moment, that operation of D-Day. And we find this note that he kept in his pocket that he wrote out and said, if this operation fails, it fails because of me and no one else. And he signs it. He accidentally signs it July 5th, not June 5th. They almost move the operation because the weather is bad, but they move forward. And as you well know now, thousands died on the beach at Normandy, but that was a turning point of the war, and it changed the whole dynamic. Those moments of his time as leader framed his leadership style in the White House. He comes back and is obviously a hero. Truman at the time realizes how powerful he is as a name and says, you should run as a Democrat. I will, in fact, step aside and be your vice president. Eisenhower says, no, thank you. Isn't really interested in politics, doesn't really love politics, says no thanks. He then goes to Columbia University. Truman doesn't particularly like that he kind of gives him the Heisman Award there. And then Eisenhower is courted by the Republicans shortly thereafter, and courted hard, again and again and again. And he finally relents and decides, okay, I'm going to run. And the animosity between Truman and Eisenhower, I never fully realized how angry Truman was and how Eisenhower responded to it. But we found a lot of letters and amazing oral histories that had never really been mined, never been tapped. There's some of these things where Eisenhower is talking about this himself that I hadn't seen. It may have advised someone in the past, but they said that at the library that people hadn't really spent the time to go into this particular reflection. So these oral histories provide this background, this narrative that we write in the book. So Truman then gets very upset and says on the campaign trail, as Eisenhower is on the road, he doesn't know anything about politics, about governing. He knows as much about governing as a pig knows about Sunday. And Eisenhower finally gets really upset, and the relationship really goes south. Eisenhower obviously wins, and he has those ads that are very iconic now, the I Like Ike song, and he travels the country, and it's a big uprising, and he crushes Democrat Adlai Stevenson in that election. He goes to the White House on Inauguration Day, and the relationship between Truman is so bad that the Eisenhowers stay in the car instead of going in the White House for the pre-inauguration coffee in the White House. They stay in the car, the Trumans stay in the White House, so there's this standoff at the portico there, and finally the Trumans get in. The Truman Library and the Eisenhower Library describe it as a silent ride from the White House to the Capitol for the swearing in. Fast forward, Truman and Eisenhower make up after, unfortunately, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And they meet and have lunch at the Blair House and ended up talking and establishing more rapport after that moment. Eisenhower comes into office, and the inauguration, the day before inauguration, before that standoff and the drive to the Capitol, January 19th, which would have been 2 days from now, and he goes to church here, National Presbyterian Church, with his wife Mamie, and he is sitting in a pew, and he is trying to think about what he's going to say in his inauguration speech in 1953. So let's see, that's 59 years ago, right? Yeah. He is in the church pew and is wondering how he's going to capture people's attention. And he decides that he's going to open his inaugural speech with a prayer. And he scribbles the prayer on a piece of paper as he's in the pew in church on the 19th. And he decides that he's going to get up and he asks all Americans to bow their heads. Imagine this. I mean, they've just done the swearing in. He gets up, he says, please bow your heads. And he says, Almighty God, as we stand here at this moment, my future associates in the executive branch of government join me in beseeching that thou will make full and complete our dedication to the service of people in this throng and their fellow citizens everywhere. Give us, we pray, the power to discern clearly right from wrong, and allow all our words and actions to be governed thereby and by the laws of this land. Especially we pray that our concern shall be for all the people, regardless of station, race, or calling. May cooperation be permitted and be the mutual aim of those who, under the concepts of our Constitution, hold to differing political faiths, so that all may work for the good of our beloved country and thy glory. Amen. A simple prayer delivered with a lot of feeling and sincerity, and it really did reflect the true meaning of Eisenhower, and that's what he wanted. He wanted to open with that, something that was him, that was Kansas, that was Middle America. His speechwriters had a bunch of different drafts that were very flowery, and he said, no, I'm going to open with this, and it'll be a plain-spoken address. For Eisenhower, faith was his compass. He credited it throughout his life. Said, I couldn't have made it through the darkest moments in the war without prayer. And while he didn't wear it on his sleeve in the White House, his actions, and sometimes when he put into speeches, you could tell that it was a driving force. So the other reason I chose Eisenhower is because he's the first, believe it or not, television president. And he was a big advocate for the press. Before President Eisenhower, no news conference with a president was ever on the record. You could go to a news conference with the president, you could ask him questions, but none of it was on the record. It was, you had to paraphrase the president. So the White House always had the out that the president didn't really say it that way, or he didn't mean it that way, or you got it wrong, because they couldn't quote the president directly. Eisenhower comes in and he says, that's ridiculous. Put the transcripts out. That's how he starts. Well, reporters have a field day because when they ask him questions, he's kind of halting and stop and start, and that became the meme that journalists used, was that he was kind of, wasn't great at delivering words. He then says, you know what, you can record them with a radio or TV broadcast, the news conferences, and then he allows the first live broadcast of a president answering questions from reporters. And that's the first time that Americans had seen their leader being questioned by the Fourth Estate. So for me, a television anchor who covers politics, that was a big thing. He was about transparency. He was about getting out what you could get out. He fought hard, for example, for the archives in the later years in life to get out to people and to be accessible, and also to speed up the declassification process. He was about transparency, so much so that he had a heart attack in 1955 in office, and it left him deciding whether he was going to run for re-election. It was a tough decision. His doctors finally said that he could, but at the beginning, when he had the heart attack, he talked to his press secretary, Jim Haggerty, and he said, Jim, I want the reporters to know, everything about the health records. Just put it out there. And we found a letter about a week later. It says, Dear Jim, looks like it's going well. I could do without the daily updates on my bowel movements. So they stopped that particular aspect. He had a great sense of humor and would really joke with his staff, but he had a short temper. We found a story from an oral history from his secretary, Ann Whitman, who said, occasionally he would get very upset, and there were different reasons why. If he was mad at somebody, he had what's called an anger drawer in the desk. So he would write their name down, And he would look at it, he would yell for a second, and then he put the slip of paper with the name in the anger drawer. And she said there were a lot of slips of paper in there. He was also angry about one thing: squirrels. He's a golfer, and he loved to go outside of the Oval Office and swing, just swing a club on the lawn. And he said every time he'd swing a club, there'd be another squirrel, darn squirrel, and he'd yell about the squirrels. And he'd come in, and Ann Whitman would be there, and she'd say, now, Mr. President, the squirrels have every much a right to be there as you do. And one time he said, you know what, and he ordered the Secret Service to round up all the squirrels on the White House property carefully and take them all to Rock Creek Park and let them go, which is quite something. Amazing notes from speechwriters who worked with him. As I said, he was a speechwriter himself as a colonel for MacArthur, but he would edit speeches, not just the farewell address, but he would edit things every day. One of the speechwriters, Bob Kiev, told us and wrote about his interaction with Ann Whitman, who, as a secretary, there were no computers at the time, so every draft she had to retype. And so he would go through drafts because he'd be circling and moving things around and editing, and she had to retype every time. So Ann Whitman preemptively would send notes to the speechwriters and say, please don't use this. Don't use this word. Did you see the boss says this? And in one of the notes it says, Bob, whatever you do, Bob, please do not use appreciation for. The boss likes appreciation of. Don't do appreciation for. Then she'd send a note and say, you know, Bob, you always say warm best wishes at the end of a speech. You know, wishes, Bob, can be warm, they can be best, but they can't be warm best, according to the President of the United States. So she'd have very specific things that you couldn't talk about. Well, Bob tells the story that he's leaving the White House, and he gets a signed picture from Eisenhower, and it says, to Bob Kiev, thank you for your service, warm best wishes, with appreciation for all the work that you've done, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And it's those little nuggets, those things that you can find in these libraries that just bring this to life. And hopefully this book does that. This farewell, it's not really about just the farewell address. It is about his life and bringing that to a younger generation. And even if you're an Eisenhower fan and you think you know about Eisenhower, I truly believe you're going to find stories like the ones I'm telling you now in here that you didn't know. The message of the farewell address is threefold. One, it is a roadmap of caution and balance. It is a message he was delivering to his successor, President Kennedy, but it was also talking to America about what he had learned. It was overlooked that he talked in that address about the deficit and the debt, and that we can't mortgage our families and our children's future with what we spend as a nation. He also talked about bipartisanship and working across the aisle and making sure that you get the things you can get done first before you argue about what you can't get done. He worked in office very closely with House Speaker Sam Rayburn and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Baines Johnson. In fact, he had lawmakers of both parties over to the White House at least once a month, if not more, for drinks and just to talk about things. And that was how he managed to work with the other side. His warnings about national security, though, the most common phrase and sentence that gets used and talked about, and it's why it's in the top 100 National Archives documents, is the military-industrial complex. He really wanted to, at the beginning, call it the military-industrial scientific congressional complex. But his speechwriters were convinced that by putting congressional in there, Capitol Hill would get a little offended, but that's really what he meant. He was concerned that all the companies that had turned their efforts to support World War II had then turned their efforts to be making money, and that money was leading the day, but was not thinking about policy for the United States going forward. It made him livid. Besides the squirrels, it made him livid to see these ads of defense contractors for missiles in magazines like Life magazine. He would slam his hand down on the table and say, how many times do we have to kill a man about how many nuclear missiles we had as a country? The thing that made him mad about Kennedy is on the campaign trail, Kennedy was campaigning that America was weak and that we were losing in the missile production. He said there was a missile gap with the Soviets. Well, Eisenhower knew that was not true, and the Soviets were not churning missiles out like sausages, and we had many more. So that made him mad about Kennedy. He was skeptical of Kennedy. He thought at first he was hollow and young and didn't have a lot of experience. He meets in the first chapter of this book as president-elect, and he comes to the Oval Office, and Eisenhower is really impressed with him. We have great oral histories from both Kennedy and Eisenhower of that meeting so that we can describe it in a narrative form. And Eisenhower looks at him and says, you know, maybe this is why the American people chose him, because he's got this depth and this magnetism. Kennedy does. And they hit it off. Both sides hit it off. But Eisenhower is worried that Kennedy doesn't fully appreciate what Eisenhower had set up in the national security apparatus to debate and argue dissenting views on all aspects of operations. So Eisenhower leaves, he delivers the farewell address, Kennedy takes over, and obviously we know now that Cuba and the Bay of Pigs happens. The operation goes forward in the first days. It was an operation that was planned in the Eisenhower years, in its infancy, but in that Oval Office meeting and subsequent meetings with Kennedy, Eisenhower says there are stipulations. One, there has to be a Cuban exile government in waiting someplace else. Two, there has to be someone who can take over for Castro. And three, U.S. air power has to be used to support these guys that we're training. One didn't happen. Two didn't happen before the operation is launched by Kennedy. And at the last moment, President Kennedy calls off the air power, saying he doesn't want anyone to know it's the U.S. It is a disaster. And Kennedy calls it a disaster himself. The first person he calls is former President Eisenhower. And he flies him out to Camp David, and that is that iconic image on the front of the book where Eisenhower is walking up the path at Camp David. And we have the quotes from both libraries. As they're walking up, Kennedy says to Eisenhower, you know, you don't really know how tough this job is until you're in it. And Eisenhower turns to Kennedy and smiles and says, with all due respect, President Kennedy, I think I told you that 3 months ago. From that moment on, Kennedy tapped Eisenhower, called him a lot, and talked to him and used it and kind of set up some of the dissenting voices about operations going forward. And I think that image best depicts a moment where looking back and the experience of the past helps the future. And I think this book, that's what I'm hoping does, is that we can learn from Eisenhower now. And I think that this transition back then really fits with the transition now. The book starts with that meeting between President-elect Kennedy and President Eisenhower, and it ends with a meeting between President-elect Trump and President Obama. How did I do that? Well, it was the election, and 3 months before was my deadline, before the election. So I wrote two endings. I wrote an ending that Hillary Clinton won, and this is the one I spent the most time on, and the lessons that Hillary Clinton could learn from Eisenhower. and I really crafted it and tried to make it perfect. And then I spent time, but not as much time, on the Donald Trump wins and the similarities, the outside figure, and I imagine how he wins, why he wins, and I had obviously covered along the way up until that point all of the different aspects of the campaign. But Twitter, I was asked what Eisenhower would think of Twitter. I said, well, first he would say, what's Twitter? And then he would say, get off that thing, because less is more, and words matter. But so I write this chapter 3 months before. This is right after the Access Hollywood tape comes out from that whole thing. So I'm thinking this is going to be really good fiction at that moment. As I announce on election night at 2:30 in the morning, Pennsylvania has gone to Donald Trump, and he will be the 45th president of the United States. I'm thinking, that chapter really works. So then I got some behind-the-scenes background of the meeting between President-elect Trump and President Obama that hadn't been out there, and added that to the top of the chapter. And I think it gives an experience of why this transition is relevant today. And again, I just want to thank the National Archives, the libraries, their help. It's been a real, true honor to work on this. And it has enabled me to have a better perspective on things as I get ready to cover the inauguration on Friday. That coverage, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m., Fox News Channel. I'll be anchoring with Martha McCallum for the day. But I really appreciate it. I'm happy to talk to anybody up by the signing if you'd like to get a book. And thanks for having me today.